I found him huddled behind a grocery dumpster, helpless, wounded, and unable to see. They laughed when I carried that old orange cat home, but what happened later changed everything. I was 56 when our paths crossed. My life had become quiet, folded in on itself after the divorce and my daughter moving away. I was just discarding some cardboard when I heard it, a sound that wasn't asking for help, but demanded it anyway. A low, broken cry that I couldn't ignore. I followed it to a pile of soaked boxes, and there he was. An old orange cat with scars pulled tight across his face. His eyes cloudy and empty, blood dried along his ear. His body thin but stubbornly upright. When I reached for him, he did not flinch. He leaned into my palm as if he had been waiting. I wrapped him in my coat and held him against my chest. His ribs moved fast and shallow. His fur smelled like rust and rain. I told him he was safe even though I was not sure yet. The vet later said he had been blind for years. Maybe beaten, maybe burned, maybe simply forgotten. And they said he was old and damaged and would cost more than he was worth. I nodded and paid anyway. I named him Ember because his fur still glowed even when the light was gone from his eyes. At home, he learned the rooms by memory. Every step careful but determined, every sound memorized. He slept pressed against my leg like an anchor. When my family came over for dinner weeks later, Ember followed the sound of my voice into the living room. His scars visible in the bright light, his blindness obvious in the way his head tilted. My sister laughed softly and said he looked creepy. My brother asked why I would choose something so broken. They said I should have gotten a kitten. Something cute, something easy, something worth showing off. I smiled and said nothing. Ember climbed into my lap and purred. They did not hear the strength in it. They did not feel how steady his heart was against mine. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I swallowed it down. That night after they left, I brushed Ember slowly. Counting each stroke like a promise, he leaned into the brush, trusting me completely. I whispered that he belonged here, that no one would ever leave him again. I meant it with everything I had. I did not know yet how much that promise would cost me, or how cruel people could be when they think love is a weakness. Ember slept with his paw curled around my wrist, and I stayed awake listening to his breath, already choosing him over everyone else without knowing it. Life with Ember settled into a rhythm that felt older than both of us. Mornings began with his slow steps across the floor, counting the distance to the kitchen. His whiskers touching walls and chair legs like memory made physical. I learned to move things only when necessary. I learned to speak before touching him. He learned my breathing and followed it. When I sat, he appeared at my side. When I slept, he guarded the space near my heart. Neighbors noticed him through the window and asked why his eyes looked like that. I told them he could still see what mattered. They smiled politely the way people do when they think kindness is foolish. I took Ember to the park on warm afternoons, carried in a sling against my chest. Children stared and parents pulled them closer. One woman asked if he was sick. Another said blind animals should be put down for their own good. I nodded and kept walking. Ember pressed his head under my chin and purred louder when voices grew sharp. He trusted me to decide what was safe. I trusted him to remind me who I was becoming. Someone quieter and harder at the same time. Love had narrowed my focus until nothing else seemed important. My family visits became shorter. Conversations circled around Ember whether I invited it or not. They joked about his scars and called him a burden. They said I was wasting money and time. They said I was hiding behind an animal because it could not leave me. I laughed softly and poured more tea. I did not argue. Arguing would have meant admitting they could hurt me. Ember listened from my lap, his ears turning toward every word. His body never tense, never afraid. He trusted my calm even when it was forced. Late one evening, my sister stayed behind after everyone left. She looked at Ember sleeping curled like a small flame on the couch. She said I was letting my life rot with him. She said love should be rewarding, not embarrassing. I felt something harden behind my ribs. I told her he had saved me first. She rolled her eyes and said I would regret choosing a broken cat over people. I closed the door after her and locked it. Ember woke at the sound and reached for me, his paw finding my hand without searching. And in that moment, I knew the judgment was only beginning. The comments changed after that. They were no longer jokes wrapped in smiles. They became statements delivered like advice. My brother called and said I was isolating myself. My mother asked why I never traveled anymore. I told them Ember could not be left alone, that his world depended on routine. They sighed as if I had chosen inconvenience on purpose. They spoke about him as if he were a habit I could break, not a life that trusted me with every step. When I hung up the phone, Ember was beside me, his head lifted toward my voice, his tail brushing my ankle in quiet reassurance. One afternoon, I came home to find my front door unlocked. My heart dropped before I even stepped inside. Ember cried out from the living room, a sharp, confused sound I had never heard from him before. My sister stood there holding his carrier. She said she was helping me. She said she had made an appointment at a shelter that specialized in special needs animals. She said he would be better off somewhere else. Somewhere with professionals. I took the carrier from her hands slowly. Ember pressed himself against the back corner, shaking. His trust cracked but not broken. I told her to leave. She laughed and said I was being dramatic. She said no one would adopt an old, blind, scarred cat. She said he would probably be put down quietly. Like it was a kindness, something inside me went cold and steady. I told her if she ever touched him again, I would call the police. The word police startled her more than my tone. She left angry and offended. Telling me I was choosing an animal over family, I locked the door and slid down against it. Ember found me and pressed his face into my neck, purring low and rough, grounding me back into my body. That night, I did not sleep. I watched Ember breathe. Each rise and fall counted like proof. I realized then that their judgment was not just noise. It was a threat. They believed they knew better than me. They believed love needed their approval. I began to plan quietly. Not revenge yet, but protection. I documented visits. I updated microchip information. I changed locks and routines. Ember followed me from room to room, sensing the shift. He did not know what danger looked like, but he knew when I was preparing. And he stayed close, trusting that I would not fail him. After that day, my home stopped feeling invisible to them. My phone rang more often with voices checking in that felt like inspections. My mother asked questions about Ember health, framed as concern but sharpened with doubt. My brother suggested I take a break and let someone else handle him for a while. I said no every time, calmly and without explanation. Ember sensed the tension in the air and became more careful. He memorized new pads after I moved furniture closer to walls. He waited for my signal before stepping into rooms. His trust deepened even as the world outside our door grew restless. The breaking point came during a family birthday dinner at my house. I hesitated before hosting, but I refused to shrink my life further. Ember stayed in the bedroom, resting on my sweater. Halfway through the evening, my sister excused herself and disappeared down the hallway. I followed quietly and found her crouched beside the bed, whispering into her phone. She said this was proof I was unstable. She said the house smelled like sickness. She said she would record everything. Ember lifted his head, confused by the unfamiliar voice so close. My sister did not see me standing there. I stepped forward and told her to leave my home immediately. She stood and said I could not stop her from caring about family. She said she had already spoken to animal control about welfare checks. The word checks landed like a threat wrapped in legality. I felt the room narrow around me. I picked up Ember and held him tight. His heart raced, but he did not struggle. He trusted my grip, even as my hand shook. I told her she was no longer welcome. She smiled and said we would see about that. Then she walked out like she had won something. That night, I understood that silence alone would not protect us anymore. I began collecting proof the way others collect memories. Photos of Ember eating and playing, videos of him navigating the house confidently, receipts from every vet visit and medication. I spoke to a lawyer quietly and learned my rights. I installed cameras and alarms and stopped answering calls. Ember adapted to the changes without complaint. He followed the new sounds and signals with patience, curled beside me as I worked late into the night. My fear slowly reshaping itself into resolve. I was no longer just defending a cat. I was preparing to expose something darker. The call came on a quiet morning when Ember was curled in a sun patch by the window. Animal control said they were responding to a concern about neglect. Their voices were professional but distant. I invited them in without hesitation. Ember lifted his head at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps and waited for my cue. I knelt beside him and touched his shoulder once. He relaxed instantly. The officers watched closely as he stood and walked toward the water bowl without stumbling, his memory carrying him where sight could not. I explained his routine slowly and clearly, my voice steady even as my pulse raced. They examined the house and asked questions. I answered with facts and documents already laid out on the table. Vet records dated and organized, medication schedules printed and signed. Photos of Ember from the day I found him until now. His scars unchanged, but his body stronger. One officer softened when Ember reached out and touched her boot gently with his paw. A small, deliberate gesture of curiosity, not fear. She knelt and let him sniff her hand. Her expression changed in a way I recognized as understanding. The other officer nodded and said he saw no cause for concern. After they left, my phone lit up with messages. My sister accused me of humiliating her. She said people were talking. She said I had made her look cruel. I read every word without replying. Ember pressed against my legs, sensing the shift. I realized then that she had expected me to panic and surrender. She had expected authority to side with her certainty. Instead, she was exposed by my preparation. The betrayal was no longer quiet now. It echoed outward, touching people she had not planned for. That evening, I posted Ember's story online, not as an attack, but as truth. I shared his journey and the joy he brought me. I shared what blind animals needed and how little patience cost. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Strangers defended him with words sharper than mine had ever been. Donations were offered to rescues. Messages poured in from people who saw their own loved ones reflected in his scars. Ember slept through it all unfazed, his trust complete. While I watched the tide turn slowly and deliberately, the first step of quiet justice settling into place. The attention did not fade like I expected. It settled and stayed. My phone chimed with messages from people who understood quiet devotion. Rescues asked permission to share Ember's story. A local reporter reached out wanting to talk about senior blind animals and the families who love them. I agreed, carefully setting boundaries the way I had learned to do. Ember adjusted to the small changes with patience. He learned the sound of a camera shutter and the rhythm of interviews. He sat beside me calm and present as if he knew his existence alone was enough. My family response shifted from accusation to damage control. My mother called crying, saying everything had gone too far. My brother asked why I had to make things public. My sister sent a message saying she had only tried to help and now strangers were attacking her online. I read the words slowly, feeling nothing sharp anymore. I replied once, saying the truth had already been visible to anyone willing to look. I said I would not protect cruelty with silence again. Ember lifted his head at the sound of my voice, firm and certain. His tail tapped against the couch in quiet approval. The reporter visited our home one afternoon. She moved gently and spoke before entering rooms. Ember approved of her immediately. He walked toward her voice and sat at her feet waiting. She knelt and listened as I told the story without embellishment. She asked how I stayed calm through judgment and betrayal. I told her love teaches you when noise is unnecessary. I told her Ember showed me how to move forward without needing to see the whole path. When the article was published, it focused on dignity, not drama. And that choice mattered. After that, my sister stopped calling entirely. Her absence felt like a door closing softly instead of a slam. I grieved the idea of who I thought she was while accepting who she had shown herself to be. Ember sensed the shift and became lighter somehow. He played more often, batting at a cloth mouse with careful confidence. He greeted mornings with louder purrs, as if the threat he could not name had finally passed. I watched him and understood that preparation had worked. not because I had exposed anyone publicly, but because I had refused to disappear quietly. The ground beneath us finally steadied again. The quiet that followed was unfamiliar at first. My phone no longer rang with accusations or apologies. Days stretched without interruption. Ember and I settled deeper into our shared rhythm. Mornings were slower now. I opened windows to let fresh air move through the rooms while he mapped the sunlight with his body. He followed warmth from rug to couch like a living compass. I realized how much tension I had been carrying when it finally loosened. My shoulders dropped and my breath deepened. Ember noticed immediately and pressed his head into my side as if confirming the change. I began volunteering at a small rescue once a week. Ember came with me on quiet afternoons. The staff trusted him to move freely. He navigated unfamiliar spaces by listening and remembering. Other animals sensed his calm and mirrored it. People watched him with softened expressions. Some cried without understanding why. I spoke gently about patience and respect and the danger of assuming weakness. Ember rested at my feet during those talks, his presence more convincing than any words I could offer. He became a symbol without ever trying to be one. One evening, I received an email from my sister workplace. Not from her, but from a colleague apologizing for past comments she'd overheard. She said the article had changed how they saw things. That questions had been asked and uncomfortable conversations followed. I felt no satisfaction reading it, only a quiet certainty that truth moves on its own time. I did not forward the message or respond. I deleted it and made tea. Ember listened to the kettle and waited by his bowl. His needs simple and immediate, grounding me back into the present. That night, Ember struggled briefly with pain from old injuries. I sat with him on the floor, holding him as his breathing steadied. I realized then that revenge had never been my goal. Protection had been, dignity had been. I had not raised my voice or demanded apologies. I had simply refused to step aside. Ember licked my hand once, a deliberate, grateful gesture. And I understood that strength does not announce itself. It prepares and endures. I stayed there with him until sleep returned. The room filled with quiet certainty that whatever came next, we would meet it together. The invitation arrived quietly in my email. A family gathering planned months ahead before everything fractured. A milestone birthday for my mother. Neutral ground at a rented hall, no pressure, just information. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Ember slept beside my laptop, his body warm and familiar. I had not planned to see them again so soon, if ever, but something in me felt ready. Not to reconcile, but to stand without shrinking. I replied that I would attend and that Ember would be with me. The response was delayed and carefully polite. Permission disguised as acceptance. The day of the gathering, I prepared slowly. Ember sensed the importance and stayed close. I brushed his fur until it shone soft and bright. His scars still visible, but no longer defining. At the hall, voices filled the space, layered with tension and forced cheer. Conversations faltered when they saw him. Whispers followed our path. I moved calmly, greeting people by name. Ember walked beside me, guided by my voice and memory. He did not stumble or hesitate, his confidence disarming in its simplicity. I felt eyes shift from judgment to uncertainty. My sister stood near the back, surrounded by people who avoided looking at her directly. When Ember approached, guided by my voice, she stiffened. He stopped a short distance away and sat facing our sound. His head tilted, listening, not afraid, not aggressive, just present. The room quieted without instruction. Someone asked softly how he learned to move like that. I explained his routines and trust and time. I did not mention betrayal or calls or threats. The absence of accusation heavier than any confrontation could have been. My sister left early without saying goodbye. Later, my mother approached us with tears that felt real this time. She knelt slowly and let Ember sniff her hand. He touched her fingers gently and accepted the contact. She apologized without excuses. I listened without interrupting. I did not offer forgiveness or denial. I simply nodded, acknowledging the moment without surrendering ground. Ember leaned into my leg and purred steady and loud. The sound filled the space where words usually rushed in. I realized then that this was the exposure I had prepared for. Not public humiliation, but undeniable presence. We left together before the evening ended, complete and intact, carrying our quiet truth with us. After that night, the world felt settled in a way I had not known before. Not happy exactly, but aligned. Ember and I returned to our routines without the weight of anticipation. Mornings were quiet and purposeful. He waited by the door while I put on my shoes. He listened for the keys and stepped aside automatically, his trust in the pattern absolute. I realized how deeply he had adapted to me and how deeply I had adapted to him. We had shaped our lives around mutual awareness. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just steady presence moving forward. Messages from extended family slowed and softened. Some offered apologies without details. Others simply sent photos of gardens and pets as peace offerings. I accepted none and rejected none. I let them exist without response. Ember taught me that acknowledgement did not require engagement. That listening could be silent. I focused instead on what mattered. His health checkups, his comfort, his small pleasures, the way he liked his food warmed slightly. The way he paused before stairs, waiting for my breath to change. These details grounded me more than any reconciliation ever could. One afternoon while volunteering at the rescue, a young woman approached me holding a carrier. Inside was an older cat missing one eye, shaking with fear. She said her family told her to give him up because he was too much. She had read about Ember and wanted to try anyway. I knelt beside her and spoke softly about patience and preparation. Ember rested nearby listening. The cat inside the carrier calmed when he heard Ember purr. The sound low and steady like a signal. I watched understanding pass between two animals shaped by survival. And I felt something gentle and final settle into place inside me. That evening at home, Ember climbed into my lap, unprompted, and rested his head against my chest. His weight familiar, reassuring, I thought about all the moments I'd been expected to justify my love, to explain why I chose him and how none of that mattered now. The judgment had burned itself out against consistency. There was nothing left to prove. I stroked his fur, slowly following the pattern of scars that no longer felt like wounds. Just history. Ember purred and slept, and I understood that quiet revenge does not seek to wound others. It simply refuses to abandon what it protects, and in that refusal, it outlasts everything else. Time softened everything without erasing it. Ember grew slower and lighter as seasons passed. His steps more deliberate, his naps longer, but his confidence never faded. He still found his way to me in every room, still waited for my voice before moving forward. The vet visits became more frequent and gentler. Focused on comfort, not correction, I adjusted our routines without complaint. Carry him more, rested with him longer. Each moment felt weighted and precious without being heavy. Love had learned how to sit quietly beside inevitability. On one clear morning, Ember did not rise with the sun. He stayed curled against my chest, breathing shallow but calm. I spoke to him, steadily telling him where he was and that he was safe. He pressed his forehead into my collarbone one last time. A familiar anchoring gesture, then his body relaxed completely. There was no fear, no struggle, just release. I held him long after the room went silent, memorizing his warmth and the shape he left behind. Grief arrived slowly like dusk, filling a space that had been bright for a long time. I buried Ember beneath the old maple tree in my yard where sunlight filtered gently through the leaves. I placed his favorite blanket there, folded carefully. Neighbors stood at a respectful distance. Some cried, though they had only known him in passing. My family did not come, and that felt right. The absence no longer a wound. I spoke aloud, thanking him for choosing me and for trusting me when the world had taught him not to. The wind moved through the branches like a breath, and I felt steady enough to stand. Now when people ask about Ember, I tell them the truth. That he taught me how to protect without cruelty and how to stand without shouting. That love does not ask permission and dignity does not need witnesses. I volunteer still and speak still and open my home still. Not to replace him, but to honor what he gave me. The betrayal that once threatened us feels small now, overshadowed by the life we lived fully and quietly. Ember was never broken. He was complete from the moment he trusted me. And in keeping that trust, I became complete too.